on that first resurrection day, almost 2 millennia ago, most of creation had no idea what was going on. Some of them that were around the crucifixion on Good Friday could have cared less about Sunday. They'd seen Jews crucified before by the Romans. There was nothing unusual about that. The reality is that for a very, very small handful of God's people alive in that time and place, that first resurrection Sunday made any difference at all. Most of them could have cared. Maybe the same thing is true today, and maybe it's because somehow for too long the church has gathered for the celebration of the resurrection, and we've gotten up to about 7 o'clock in the morning when the women leave the garden tomb after finding out Jesus is not there, and that's as far as we go with the story. But you know that 2 millennia ago, just like today, Easter Sunday begins at midnight and ends at midnight, and it's a 24-hour period, and a whole lot of things happen. There's one thing I think that ties all of those things together. Of course, it starts with the women who go to the garden and look in the tomb and they don't find Jesus, and all of a sudden 2 angels appear and say, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, he is risen." And at that moment, we have the first proclamation of the good news that has been proclaimed by the Christian community for 2,000 years. Alleluia! Christ is risen. Alleluia! He is risen indeed. But the story doesn't end there, because it says that they immediately left the garden tomb and went back to where the disciples and some other folks were. We're not quite sure where that was. All we know is that they were in hiding in fear of the authorities, because they were afraid the same thing that happened to Jesus was going to happen to them. And Luke tells us that when the women went back to the tomb, they told the disciples, "Hey, guess what? The tomb is empty. He's not there." And a couple of angels said that he's risen, and he is no longer dead. Luke says most of the disciples didn't believe him. Peter went to check it out for himself. And almost immediately the story switches to later in the day, when 2 people, Cleopas and someone else who is unnamed, are on their way to Emmaus, a village about 7 miles distant. They're walking down the road and they're talking. In one of the scriptures it says they're debating, maybe the first church argument about what the faith really meant. They're talking about the events of the last 3 days and trying to make sense of it, and all of a sudden Jesus is with them. Now, they don't know who he is. And he asks them, "What are you discussing as you walk along?" And remember what they say? "Well, we're talking about Jesus, a prophet, mighty in word and deed, and we had hoped that he would be the one to redeem Israel, but they killed him on Friday. But some women of our group came back this morning and said they had been to the garden tomb and he wasn't there, and they had been told that he is not dead, he is risen." And the good news is proclaimed again, this time not in a garden, but on a road. And the disciples and Jesus head on, and he's going to act like he's going on past Emmaus, and they beg him to stay with him because it's getting late and there's no reason he ought to keep traveling. And he goes in and they sit down at a table, and he takes a loaf of bread, and it says he blessed it, and he broke it, and he gave it to them. Same thing we're going to do this morning. And it says, "And when that happened, the risen Savior was known to them in the breaking of the bread, and the good news, he is not here, he has risen, is proclaimed again." At a garden tomb, on a dusty road, at a table. See, I've said for years, and it always gets me in trouble, but I believe it. Easter is an important historical day in my life. For me, it is history that Jesus died and rose from the dead on that first Easter Sunday. Nothing I say or do can change that. I think the most important day for the Christian church is not Easter Day, but the day afterward, when you and I figure out whether we are going to spend time in all of the gardens of our lives and on the roads of our lives and at the tables of our lives proclaiming the good news. Because guess what? I don't think the world's that different than it was 2,000 years ago. I suspect that for most of the people in God's world today, this day and what we celebrate means absolutely nothing. I would even go so far as to say that may be true of the majority of the people that live in this country that calls itself a Christian nation. I got a phone call yesterday from my daughter. I'll probably hear about this when I get home. She was taking our grandson, who's 12, to school on Friday morning. And she said, out of the blue, he says, "So, Mom, what's up with this alleged resurrection stuff?" Excuse me? And she says, "Well, you know, you have to be careful where you say that, because for some people it's not alleged. They really do believe he died and rose from the dead. Your grandpa's one of them." And he said, "Well, maybe the more important question is, what do bunnies and eggs have to do with it if that's really the message?" Man, out of the mouths of babes. Because you see, the reality is that Easter Sunday did not end with the first proclamation that he is risen. In fact, the day is filled with the proclamation over and over in different places to different groups of people, because it was the news of the day. 2,000 years later, it is the news of the day. And we have a whole world out there like the world 2,000 years ago who will not understand the importance of what we celebrate unless we are willing to go out wherever we may find ourselves. Gardens, roads, tables, whatever. To say to the people we meet, he is not here, he is risen. Hallelujah. We invite our ushers to come forward now as we receive